As of 2024, the world is drowning in debt, more than $300 trillion of it. That's over 3 times the size of the entire global economy. And what's even more surprising, every single country is in debt. The United States owes over $34 trillion. Japan's debt is more than 260% of its GDP. Even countries with budget surpluses, like Norway or Switzerland, still carry public debt. But here's the big question. If everyone is borrowing, who exactly are they borrowing from? And why doesn't the global economy collapse under the weight of so much debt? In this video, we'll explore 7 essential questions. 1. What is national debt? 2. Why do governments borrow? 3. Who do they owe? 4. Is debt always bad? 5. What happens when a country can't pay? 6. Why global debt keeps growing? 7. And whether we should worry about it? Let's start at the beginning with what national debt actually is. Part 1. What is national debt? National debt is the total amount of money a government owes to lenders. It's built up over time, usually when a country spends more than it collects in taxes. That gap between spending and revenue is called a deficit. And to cover it, governments borrow, often by issuing bonds. If a country runs a deficit one year, that amount gets added to its total debt. Run a deficit every year, and the debt adds up fast. Now, it's important to distinguish 2 related but different terms. A deficit is what happens in a single year, when the spending exceeds income. Debt is the total amount the government has borrowed over time to cover all those past deficits. Think of it like this. The deficit is how much you overspent this month. Debt is your total credit card balance after doing that every month for years. But not all debt is the same. There are 2 main types of national debt. 1, domestic debt, money borrowed from individuals or institutions within the country, like banks, pension funds, or the central bank. 2, external debt, money borrowed from foreign governments, international investors, or institutions like the IMF. Let's look at the United States as an example. As of 2024, the U.S. owes more than $34 trillion in national debt, but about 70% of that is held domestically by the Federal Reserve, American investment funds, retirement accounts, and individuals. Only the remaining 30% is held by foreign entities, including countries like Japan, China, and the UK. This matters because domestic debt tends to be more stable. Governments are less likely to face pressure or panic from their own citizens than from foreign creditors. In contrast, some developing nations, like Sri Lanka or Argentina, rely heavily on external debt, which makes them more vulnerable to global shocks or currency swings. So now that we understand what national debt is, let's explore why governments borrow in the first place. Part 2, why do governments borrow? So now we know what national debt is, but why do governments borrow in the first place? The short answer? Because they spend more than they collect in taxes. Governments have massive responsibilities: healthcare, education, defense, pensions, infrastructure, disaster relief, and more. But tax revenue doesn't always cover all of it. When there's a gap, borrowing fills it. This is especially true during crises. Take the United States in 2020. When COVID-19 hit, the government unleashed an emergency stimulus package of $3.1 trillion, more than double the federal revenue that year. That money went to stimulus checks, small business loans, expanded unemployment benefits, vaccine development, and healthcare supplies. It wasn't cheap, but it helped prevent a deeper recession. Governments also borrow to fund long-term investments that drive future growth. Imagine building highways, ports, or high-speed internet infrastructure. These projects might cost billions upfront, but they can boost productivity, attract investment, and generate more tax revenue later. This type of borrowing is often considered good debt. There's also borrowing driven by political pressure. Voters want better services, but rarely support tax hikes. So politicians often choose the easy route. Borrow today, worry later. Over time, this leads to structural deficits. When governments borrow year after year, even during good economic times, and borrowing tends to feed on itself. When bonds mature, governments must refinance, borrowing more just to repay previous debt. It's like taking out a new loan to pay off an old one. And let's not forget military conflicts. War is expensive. During World War II, the U.S. national debt tripled. Modern conflicts, like in Iraq or Ukraine, also trigger sharp increases in borrowing. So in summary, governments borrow for 4 key reasons. 1. To cover annual budget shortfalls. 2. To respond to emergencies like wars or pandemics. 3. To invest in long-term infrastructure. 4. And sometimes just to avoid raising taxes. But this borrowing creates a new question. Who exactly is lending all this money to governments? Let's explore that next. Part 3. Who do countries owe? When governments borrow money, who exactly is lending it? It might seem like countries owe money to other countries, and sometimes they do. But in reality, most national debt is actually owed to people and institutions inside the country itself. Let's break this down. There are typically 3 major groups that hold a country's debt. 1. Domestic institutions, like pension funds, insurance companies, banks, and even regular citizens. 2. The central bank, which may buy government bonds to control interest rates and support the economy. 3. Foreign creditors, including other governments, international investors, and institutions like the IMF or World Bank. Take the United States, for example. As of 2024, U.S. national debt exceeds $34 trillion, but around 70% of that is held domestically. That includes the Federal Reserve, U.S. investment firms, pension funds, state and local governments, and even individuals holding treasury bonds. Only about 30% is held by foreign entities. Among them, Japan, roughly $1.1 trillion, China, around $800 billion, United Kingdom, approximately $700 billion. Why does this matter? Because debt held internally is usually more stable. The government owes money to its own citizens and institutions, and that tends to be less risky than owing to foreign creditors who can suddenly pull out. Now compare that to Argentina or Sri Lanka. These countries rely more heavily on external borrowing, often in foreign currencies. This creates serious risks: currency fluctuations, rising interest payments, loss of control over economic decisions. In 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted on its external debt for the first time in history. Why? Tourism revenue collapsed during COVID, reserves ran out, and foreign lenders stopped rolling over their loans. Another big player is the International Monetary Fund, IMF. When countries face crisis, the IMF provides emergency loans, but usually with strict conditions: spending cuts, tax increases, or currency reforms. So to summarize, governments typically owe money to their own citizens and institutions, foreign investors and governments, and global lenders like the IMF or World Bank. The mix and the risk depends on who holds the debt and in what currency. Let's now look at whether all this debt is actually bad. Part 4, is debt always bad? When people hear national debt, they often assume it's a bad thing, a sign of failure, irresponsibility, or even impending collapse. But in reality, not all debt is bad. In fact, some debt can be productive, even essential, as long as it's used wisely. Let's start with the basics. According to economist John Maynard Keynes, governments should spend, even borrow, during economic downturns to keep demand strong and avoid recessions. Why? Because government spending can create jobs, boost business confidence, and support the economy when private investment slows down. This is the foundation of Keynesian economics, and it has shaped policy for nearly a century. A good example of this is during the COVID-19 pandemic. Governments borrowed trillions to send out stimulus checks, fund healthcare, and prevent mass layoffs. That debt came at a cost, but it also prevented deeper economic damage. So how do we tell the difference between good debt and bad debt? Good debt is used to invest in the future, like building roads, schools, or clean energy. These projects improve long-term productivity and can pay for themselves over time. Bad debt happens when governments borrow just to fund everyday expenses, like paying salaries or covering subsidies, without any return on investment. Let's look at two contrasting examples. Japan has one of the highest debt to GDP ratios in the world, over 260%. But more than 90% of its debt is held domestically. Interest rates are near zero, inflation is low, and Japan has strong institutions. So despite the headline number, markets consider Japan's debt safe for now. Lebanon, on the other hand, had a debt to GDP ratio around 150%, much lower than Japan, but most of it was short-term, in foreign currency, and tied to political instability. In 2020, Lebanon defaulted, the currency collapsed, and the country plunged into a financial crisis. So it's not just how much a country owes, it's who they owe it to, what they use it for, and whether they can manage it sustainably. Used strategically, debt can be a tool for development. Used carelessly, it becomes a trap. Next up, what happens when a country can't pay its debt? Part 5, what happens if a country can't pay? So what happens if a country borrows too much and then can't pay it back? This scenario is called a sovereign default, when a nation fails to meet its debt obligations. And no, it's not just a theoretical risk. It happens more often than you might think. Let's start with one of the most infamous cases. Argentina, once one of the wealthiest countries on earth, has defaulted on its national debt 9 times in just the past century. In 2001, it failed to repay over $100 billion, triggering the largest sovereign default in history at the time. The results were catastrophic. The currency collapsed, unemployment skyrocketed, banks froze withdrawals, mass protests erupted across the country, 5 presidents resigned in less than 2 weeks. The entire nation spiraled into political and economic chaos. But why do countries default? There are usually several warning signs. Debt becomes too large to manage. Borrowing is in foreign currency, making repayment harder. The economy slows down, shrinking tax revenues. Political instability makes reforms impossible. Investors lose confidence and stop lending. Unlike individuals or companies, A country can't declare bankruptcy in the traditional sense, but it can stop paying, and the consequences are brutal. Its credit rating crashes, it loses access to global capital markets. The local currency devalues rapidly, inflation surges. Citizens face spending cuts, tax hikes, and rising prices. Take Sri Lanka, for example. In 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted on its external debt for the first time ever. The country had borrowed heavily, especially from China, to build infrastructure like ports and highways. But when tourism revenue collapsed during COVID and foreign reserves dried up, the government simply couldn't pay. The fallout? Fuel and electricity shortages, long lines at gas stations, soaring food prices, nationwide protests. The president fled the country by plane. Default isn't just a financial failure, it becomes a human crisis. And escaping that crisis is difficult. Countries that default often turn to the IMF for help. But IMF loans come with tough conditions: austerity, budget cuts, structural reforms. These steps may stabilize the economy, but they often cause pain in the short term, especially for the poorest citizens. So while a sovereign default isn't the end of a country, it leaves deep scars. Which brings us to a deeper question. If default is so painful, why does global debt keep rising? Let's dig into that next. Part 6. Why global debt keeps growing. After all these risks, inflation, crisis, even default, here's the real puzzle. Why does global debt keep growing anyway? Despite multiple crises and warnings, governments around the world continue to borrow more than ever. Let's look at the numbers. According to the IMF, by 2023, total global debt, including governments, households, and corporations, had reached over $305 trillion. That's more than 336% of the world's GDP. So why? There are 5 main reasons. 1. Growth depends on borrowing. Modern economies run on credit. Businesses borrow to expand, consumers borrow to buy homes and cars, and governments borrow to fund everything from roads to social programs. Without borrowing, the system slows or collapses. 2. Low interest rates made debt cheap. After the 2008 financial crisis, and again during COVID-19, central banks slashed interest rates. Borrowing became extremely affordable. Why raise taxes or cut spending when you can borrow at near zero cost? In 2020 alone, global public debt jumped by more than $12 trillion as countries rushed to fund stimulus packages. 3. Crisis after crisis, from pandemics to wars to energy shocks. Each crisis requires emergency funding. Governments can't raise taxes overnight, so they issue debt. The war in Ukraine, for example, prompted massive defense spending and energy subsidies across Europe. 4. Political incentives. Let's be honest, borrowing is politically convenient. Voters want more services, but no one likes higher taxes. So politicians often choose to spend now and let the next administration worry about repayment. 5. Financial markets reward borrowing. There's always demand for sovereign bonds, especially from pension funds, banks, and foreign investors. This makes borrowing easier, faster, and more tempting. Even low-income countries can issue bonds on international markets, often in foreign currency, despite the risks. But here's the problem. When interest rates rise, like in 2022 and 2023, the cost of servicing that debt explodes. For example, by 2023, Ghana was spending over 70% of its tax revenue just to pay interest on debt. It eventually defaulted and sought help from the IMF. So the debt keeps growing until it doesn't, until reality catches up through inflation, currency collapse, or painful reform. But as long as the system rewards short-term borrowing and assumes tomorrow will always be bigger, global debt will likely keep climbing. Next, should we be worried? Part 7, should we worry? So with all this debt piling up, should we be worried? Well, it depends. Debt itself isn't inherently bad. It can fund growth, smooth out crises, and even create wealth. But debt becomes dangerous when three things happen. 1. Interest rates rise, making it harder to repay. 2. The economy slows down, reducing tax revenue. 3. Debt is owed in foreign currencies, which can trigger currency crises. Let's look at a few real-world comparisons. The United States has over $34 trillion in debt, more than 120% of its GDP. But most of this debt is in US dollars, a global reserve currency. Its economy is large, stable, and its bonds are seen as safe. Even with high debt, the US can borrow at relatively low cost. Greece, on the other hand, had a similar debt-to-GDP ratio during the 2010 Eurozone crisis. But unlike the US, Greece couldn't print its own currency. It used the euro. When investors lost confidence, borrowing costs soared, and Greece had to accept painful bailouts and austerity measures. By 2013, unemployment hit 27%, pensions were cut, and hundreds of thousands of young Greeks left the country. Now consider developing nations like Ghana or Zambia. These countries often borrow in US dollars but earn revenue in local currency. If their currency weakens or exports fall, it becomes impossible to repay. In 2022 to 2023, rising interest rates in the US triggered a wave of debt distress in low-income countries. At least 60% of them were at high risk of, or already in, debt crisis. So yes, we should worry when debt becomes unsustainable. Economists often look at key warning signs: debt-to-GDP ratio over 100%, interest payments consuming more than 20 to 30% of government revenue, high reliance on foreign debt, weak economic growth. But not all countries face the same risk. What matters most is how debt is structured, who holds it, and whether the economy can grow enough to repay it. In short, debt isn't destiny, it's a tool. And like any tool, used well, it builds. Used poorly, it breaks. Let's wrap up. So, is national debt something to fear, or just a part of how modern economies work? As we've seen, debt isn't inherently bad. It can build bridges, fund recovery, and drive innovation, but it can also trigger crisis, inflation, and hardship if mismanaged. What really matters is how debt is used. Is it productive or political? Is it sustainable or short-sighted? Is it building the future or borrowing from it? Some nations treat debt as a tool. Others treat it like a credit card with no limit. So here's the final question we'll leave you with. In today's world, is debt a burden or a lever for progress? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know how you view national debt where you live. If this video helped clarify a complex topic, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone curious. Thanks for watching ExplainFi, where finance meets clarity.